Section 6 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 5, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 6, A Tale of Venice, by C. Macfarlane. The sun was sinking behind the dark blue hills of Priuli, and lengthening the shadows of Venice across the rippling waves of the Adriatic, when two senators who were taking their evening promenade on one of the murazzi, or outer terraces, which the industry of man had gained and secured from a formidable element, perceived a trim galley on the purple line of the horizon pressing forward toward the city. That should be a vessel of the state, said one of the signors. From whence may she be? Why, not from Constantinople, replied his companion. It is time that some of that conquering expedition should be returned to the winged lion. Saint Mark grant that it proves as you say, but she keeps a gallant course, and will soon be here to speak for herself. The two senators, who, though both advanced in years, still glowed with that patriotic spirit which was destined to raise the low-sunk islets of Venice to such unprecedented glory, leaned against a parapet wall that ran along the edge of the Murazzo, fixing their earnest gaze upon the vessel which, rapidly advancing, grew in magnitude to their eyes at every minute. She had been labouring on with all her long oars, but now the sun had set and an evening breeze, a vento di terra, from the lofty mountains of Dalmatia roughened the gulf. The sails, already set, were properly bent to catch the favouring wind, and another sail was hoisted, until the hulk seemed to bear the proportion to them that the body of the sea-fowl does to its widely spreading and pure white wings, nor could the flight of the gull or the albatross be well more rapid or direct than the sailing of the Venetian galley. She rushed like a thing of life over the darkening waves, and presently the white foam was seen curling, and the phosphoric light flashing before her impetuous bow. As she neared, the last gleams of day showed the proud banner of the Republic floating on her lofty stern. My Tebaldo, my son, my only one, fell a victim to the liquid and unextinguishable fire of the Greeks at the first siege of their heretical capital. But there are other fathers than me in Venice, and mothers who love their offspring, and wives who adore their husbands, and of a certainty for some of these there is great joy. The galley is the courier of the great Dandolo, the swiftest vessel of our fleets, and she comes, the harbinger of happiness to thousands. The rest will not be far behind. The senator who pronounced these words began in a subdued and melancholy tone, but his voice strengthened and his eye flashed as he continued, losing in the bliss of others and in the contemplation of the glory of his country the sense of his private and irremediable misfortune. Viva San Marco, viva la Santa Chiesa, and the Republic of Venice, that has but the keys of St. Peter within the boasted gates of Constantinople, exclaimed the other senator. Viva San Marco and the Republic, rejoined the childless man. Their aged voices had scarcely ceased to vibrate when a loud, continuous shout, a shout of transporting joy and triumph, rose from the deck and the rigging of the galley, and made itself heard despite of distance and the lash and roar of the waves that broke in foam at the feet of the two senators. The next instant that soul-stirring exclamation was answered by another shout that absolutely smothered, while it lasted, the sounds of wind and wave, and turning round, the senators saw, on the edges of other terraces, and on the scattered islets that afforded the best points of observations, the mass of the population of Venice gazing like themselves on the returning galley. In an instant numerous barks were seen to glide from the canali, and dancing in fantastic groups over the heaving sea, to pull with strenuous oars toward the ship, the patriotism or the more private affections of many not brooking the delay of a few minutes, which would see her at anchor within Venice. As she came, with the breeze that still freshened singing through her shrouds, a simultaneous display of countless blue lights was launched from her deck high into the heavens, where the crescent moon, with a single star at her side, seemed to smile at these testimonials of joy, and to welcome the wanderers back again. The mimics of heaven's thunders, the pealing cannons, were not yet known, but the roar of voices that again rose from the Marazzi and the ship and the boats midway between them might almost equal the rimbombo of artillery, than which it was infinitely more replete with meaning, for the united voices of thousands distinctly syllabled the patriotic cry, which was still Viva San Marco e la città di Venezia. There was silence for a while. The galley, now surrounded by the barks from the shore, glided round one of the islets which had intercepted the prospect, and presently the crew saw all the low houses of the town, with the clear domestic lights shining from their lattices, full before them. The transport that then bounded in the hearts of the wanderers, the shout that then rose from the galley deck, must have been intense. For what can consecrate the joys of home, like one glad glance from ocean's troubled foam? The two senators quitted the parapet and repaired with hasty steps to the galley quay, where they found many of their order, with most of the leading citizens already assembled, and anxiously awaiting to speak with the gallant commander of the Corriere. Soon the welcome vessel stood with her prow a few spans' length from the shore, and anon with rapid manoeuvres she swung round, and lay with her broadside against the edge of the quay. Another shout and cry of triumph, and the captain leaped on shore, and bowed before the senators and citizens of Venice. "Thou art welcome, Sanuti," said the foremost of the company. "Thou art welcome as the confirmer of good tidings, but doubly welcome as a hero who has honoured his Venetian blood by his deeds before the walls of Constantinople." The captain bowed more lowly than before. "The Scampa Via of Zani has then brought in safety our lord the Doge's despatches to the Senate of Venice?" inquired he modestly. "It has even done so much," replied the senator, "and we have long since learned that the winged lion is flying for the second time over the walls of the capital of the East." "And long may it there fly," cried Sanuti, "and may the sons of Venice plant the lion, the standard of San Marco and the Republic, over many a conquest as fair as this." The assembled multitude echoed the words of the captain, and the air was rent by shouts of Pianta Leone, the popular war cry, which was indeed destined to be heard on many a foreign shore. "But, Sanuti," resumed the senator, who had already spoken, "what of the fleet? A portion certainly should be at Venice ere this, were it but to lay the trophies in the temple of our saint, under whom our arms have so prospered. I left the fleet to-day at noon. They had gained the height of Cape Torella, and only let this fair breeze blow till midnight, and we shall see them at the rising of tomorrow's sun." This news spread with the swiftness of lightning through the multitude, and thence through the whole city, and the childless senator had predicted aright when he said that for some there would be great joy in Venice on this night. There was indeed too much joy, and alas, in many instances too much assured sorrow or harrowing apprehension to permit sleep. The affectionate wife, with tears in her eyes, kissed the little slumberer in his cradle, or assured the half forgetful prattler on her knee that tomorrow he should see his father. or with provident care she turned over the humble treasures of her coffers to select fitting raiment for her long absent spouse, or with diligent hands she prepared the restoring condiments, so welcome after the privations of a tedious sea voyage, or she sought the draughts for the wine cup which maketh glad the heart of man. The fond mother, whose son had gone to the East, with the red cross on his breast, rested not on her pillow, but gazing on the flickering lamp, asked 1,000 times, "Oh, will the light of tomorrow's sun show me my boy in his strength and in his beauty, or assure me that the light of life has for ever quitted his eyes?" The betrothed maiden, or she who had cherished a fond passion, paced her chamber floor with hurried steps, or gazing out of her chamber on the sea waves, sighed to the strong winds that agitated them, as love did her young bosom. And will he come with the morrow? And will he love me as when he went? That short summer night seemed of interminable length at Venice, but the morrow came at last, and in the grey horizon, at the very point where the Corriere had first appeared on the preceding evening, a broad white sail was seen. A sail, and another rose to the eye from that sober but brightening line, until the whole fleet was in view, and advanced, the orb of day rising in their rear, like a vast flock of wild swans, glancing their long white necks and buoyant white wings in the golden beams of morning. In the city the matin summons to prayers sounded cheerfully on the ear, and in each Christian temple a song of thanksgiving succeeded the words of supplication. Our story is laid in very remote times, but it was not until their religious duties were performed that the people of Venice began their preparations for the triumphal reception of their home-wending heroes, or hastened to meet the object of their hearts' warm affections. But when in their weakness and insufficiency they had paid their due to heaven, they entered on the business of life with zeal, and the city was agitated from one end to the other. Carpenters and other artisans were employed in laying stages for the warriors to tread upon in their descent from the victorious galleys, or in erecting platforms whence the Venetian fair might wave their kerchiefs to the brave, or galleries whence the musicians might hail the return of those who had prevailed in the good fight, with the Lion and St. Mark for their aid. Women and children ran to gather the scanty supply of verdure and of flowers that the sea-girt city afforded, but others were dispatched to the mainland to draw the laurel and the rose from the banks of the Brenta. Inanimate nature seemed to partake in the joy and triumph of man, and a bright and exhilarating sun, a gay blue sky, a sea serene, and a breeze as gentle as the sigh of happy love, were propitious to Venice and her day of rejoicing. Meanwhile the fleet came on, spread out into the figure of a crescent. Every ship was distinctly visible through that fine transparent atmosphere, and as they glided over the placid waters toward their place of rest, the appropriate banner of each was clearly seen, and the impatient citizens on shore could tell the particular galley in which had sailed a son, a brother, or a friend. "There is the Stella," cried an old man, "my own brave boy commands there." "And there the Speranza," cried another, "and God be praised, my Francesco's flag still floats on her masthead." Exclamations like these, and the eloquent outpourings of natural affection were heard every moment to proceed from the congregated thousands, while the speaking faces, the expressive Italian countenances there collected, offered to the eye a picture on which the artist might have dwelt with apprehension and delight. The fleet was now so near that the sounds of their warlike music were heard, and every detail, to use the language of the painter, was distinctly made out. The bright painted shields of the returning knights and squires were arranged on either side of the galleys. The warriors stood on the deck in their armour of mail, with the silver inlaid morion on their heads and the burnished arms in their hands. The broad lance, the battle axe, and the steel-tipped mace threw back the rays of the sun with dazzling brightness. The winged lion, the standard of the Republic, flew over their heads. The bannerets of the patrician families of Venice floated on the elevated stern quarter of the ships, while the principal galley, which had borne the blind old Dandolo to the scene of his glory, was distinguished by a vast white banner, on which was inscribed in letters of gold the new, the proud, the singular but accurate title of Lord of 3/8 of the Roman Empire, assumed by the conquering Doge, and afterward retained by the Venetian Republic. The instruments of the musicians, of which only the more clangus, as the cymbal or the trumpet had at first been heard, now were all mingled and audible. With each passing moment they waxed louder and louder, until they burst on the ear with an overpowering peal, an air of war and triumph, to which the voices of the warriors and mariners formed an accompaniment. Then there rose to heaven a shout from those on shore that made Venice to ring through her 100 islets, and the cymbal and the harp, the shrill trumpet, the spirit-stirring drum, the ear-piercing fife, gave back a response to the galleys that, gilded by the sun and reflected by the waters, now first approached land. On shore, as on the sea, the spectacle was imposing. Venice, indeed, was not yet the splendid city that claimed the world's admiration. She could not yet boast that accumulation of ancient and modern art which was afterward to attract the stranger from many a distant land. But so early as this, or at the commencement of the 13th century, Venice was a city of importance, as remarkable as she ever could be, from her peculiar situation, even beautiful and stately, if compared with the cities, her contemporaries, in any other part of the world than Italy. The Campanile, or lofty tower of St. Mark, did not yet pierce the clouds, nor did the temple then offer to the observer's eye that striking mixture of Greek and Saracenic architecture, those long extending rows of arches, that forest of columns, all of precious marble, those beautiful mosaics, and that general richness and vastness which resulted from after ages of commerce, wealth, and genius. But the bones of the blessed apostle of the evangelist, whose name, says a Venetian historian, is associated with all the glories of the Republic, had reposed there ever since the 8th century, and the devotion of the Venetians had raised over those sacred relics an edifice vast in dimensions, and not destitute of beauty. The obelisks of granite and the elaborately sculptured pillars stood not yet in the piazza or the piazzetta. The horses of bronze, those obsequious followers in the train of victory, those records of the mutability of fortune, stood not yet over the door of the temple, though they were soon to be there, for it was this returning fleet that brought them as a trophy from captured Constantinople. In fine, Egypt and Syria, Greece and the Isles of Greece, had not yet been conquered and despoiled of their glorious remains to ornament the proud sea Cybele. But at the same time some objects of art and antiquity had been imported, some improvement from the study of them had been introduced in architecture and sculpture, and Italian genius had destined in after time to rival that of Hellas had begun to dawn, and Italian taste to show itself in the construction of their habitations, their churches, and public edifices. It might be said, perhaps, that at the epoch of our tale Venice was about equidistant from what she was at her humble origin, a collection of low huts scattered on the sea-lashed sandbanks and rocks, whose poor inhabitants, Cassiodorus, the minister of Theodoric, compared to waterfowl who had fixed their nests on the bosom of the waves, and what she became after the 16th century, when the wealth of the East had been poured in her lap, and the genius of Palladio and others had filled her with beauty. But the moral picture offered to Venice at that period was perhaps far more interesting and worthy of admiration. In Venice the art and spirit of commercial industry had revived, and was then extending its pre-Arian arms to every shore of the Mediterranean. On the perilous career of conquest she had entered with great éclat, and considering her origin and position, the influence she exercised on the politics of the South, and east of Europe was astonishing. The banners of 3 subject nations did not yet float before St. Mark's, but an emperor had knelt there, a pope had been the guest of the republic, and his gratitude had invested Venice with the nuptial ring with which on each succeeding year she was to espouse the Adriatic, which she was to wear as the absolute mistress and sovereign of the seas. The glorious dawn of liberty among the neighbours of Venice, the Lombard cities, that dawn that was destined never to reach its meridian splendour, but to expire in the night of a despicable and enduring slavery, was even then a faint light compared to that which emanated from the liberal institutions of the Republic, where a hard-hearted oligarchy, anxious indeed for the glory of the state, but indifferent to human suffering and crime, had not yet seized absolute power, nor sent its victims in mystery across the bridge of sighs. The city of the Isles might at this period be compared to a hero still young, had gallantly advanced on the career of glory, whose aspirations were lofty, whose shield was not bedimmed with blood, who had not yet acquired and abused, alas, why should one be consequent on the other, extensive and uncontrolled power, to whose future successes one might look with confidence, and we, at the distance of centuries, may also partake in the enthusiasm of the old chroniclers who record the triumph of her conquering son's return from Constantinople. The Piazzetta, which is situated by the side of the church of St. Mark, then contained the principal edifices of the Republic, and it was here the knights and the captains of the galleys that had now come to anchor close to the quay, descended by stairs and platforms prepared for them, and covered with laurels and flowers, banners and silks of Tyrian dye, and it was here their anxious feet again touched their native soil, and their relatives and friends received them to their passionate embrace. As one by one they stepped on shore, the people rent the air with their exclamations. The seigneurs of the Republic, in an open balcony, bowed to them as a herald repeated their distinguished names, while the bands of music pealed the notes of triumph, and the fair daughters of Venice looked and smiled a welcome. The general picture of joy and grief there was in the midst of all these rejoicings, for many returned not to bless the eyes of affection, but remained in the country they had conquered, and many had sped to those regions whence there is no return. This general picture would be far too vast even to be sketched here, and thus we will attach ourselves to the fortunes and feelings of one who figured in this day's pageantry. Gherardo was the only son of the patrician Zani, and the most gallant youth of Venice. His love of military glory must have been great, for when the Doge, the incomparable Enrico Dandolo, invited him to follow his banner to the east, he was betrothed to Bianca Celsi, as distinguished for her beauty as he for his valour. Yet on the threshold of the hymeneal temple he did not hesitate. He would go where glory and his countrymen summoned him. When the Doge's exploits were achieved, he would return to Venice, and more deserving of her, lay the laurels at the feet of his young bride. He had prospered, Constantinople had witnessed his valour, and now returned, the Piazzetta echoed with the name of Gherardo. He had received the embraces of his aged father without alarm at his tears, for overwrought joy will weep even as sorrow does. He had been pressed in the arms of the friends of his house in his infancy, and he now advanced to a gentler circle, composed of his female relatives and friends, who, stationed at a balcony, murmured the hero's name and his welcome back to Venice. But what means this omission? Bianca was not among them. Bianca, his spouse, was not there to welcome him with eye and tongue. His voice trembled as he hurriedly asked where she was. An inconsiderate and cruel voice in the crowd answered, "Bianca is no more. She sleeps with her father in the church of St. Theodore." "No more?" moaned the young warrior, and his flushed face became pale as monumental marble, and but for his friends he had fallen to the earth like one struck by lightning. When he partially recovered from the first shock, he again raised his eyes to the lady's balcony. She was indeed not there. Where she must have been had life and love animated her. That absence confirmed the truth of the ill-omened voice. His eyes dropped despondingly to the earth, where, now in his youth and his glory, he could have wished to see a grave opened for himself. His old father fell on his neck and wept aloud. For some moments the mind of Gherardo wandered, and his soul was benumbed, but the sight of Alessio, the brother of Bianca, advancing through the crowd, recalled him to consciousness and anguish. "Is it even as they say?" cried he hoarsely, and stretching out his hand to his friend. Alessio grasped his hand with one of his, and dashing away the tears from his averted face with the other, he replied in a suffocated voice, "Alas, alas, it is even so. Bianca expired yesterday, and as the galley, your precursor, was appearing, my sister was on her road to the sepulchre." Such irremediable woe, where so much bliss was expected, such an awakening from all the ecstatic dreams and aspirations that had given him strength in battle and cheered him over the tedious and stormy waves, such a return, such a welcome, such an end to all his fond and passionate hopes, was not to be supported. With a deep groan he swooned away, and the young hero, so lately the happiest among the happy, the most animated where all were animated, was borne in a lifeless state to the sad halls of his father. It was long ere he returned to life and reason, and oh, how dreadful was his return to the latter! He would have given the world for some opiate or drug capable of repelling thought and recollection. He closed his eyes to the gay light of the sun. He would have shut out its rays for ever. He was deaf to the assiduous advice and consolation of his friends who thronged about him. He was mute, too, and asked not a single question as to the malady or disease of his bride. Was it not enough to know that she was for ever torn from him? Dead! What mattered the mode or the circumstances that had led to such a fearful result? At last he spoke, but it was only to request his father that he might be left alone. The afflicted signor, with words of affectionate condolence and prayers that his son would raise his thoughts to the contemplation of that being in whose hands were life and death, and to whose omnipotent will it was duty to submit, left the room with tears, and was followed by all the company. When, in the silence and solitude of his own chamber, Gherardo looked around him, he felt more than ever the extent of his loss. He rose from the couch on which he had been reclining, and advanced to a curtained recess at the end of the room. He drew the curtains. The sight was a cruel one. There was the talamo, or splendid nuptial bed, his friends had prepared and decorated for his return. There, on the rich velvet and the flowing silk, were the embroidered rose wreaths mixed with the laurel crowns, and the initials of his name entwined with those of the name of his Bianca, and hungry death was feeding on her roses, and her name in the mouths of men had become a note of woe in his ear, a sound of despair. He threw himself on the ground at the bed's foot, and burying his burning face in his hands, gave vent for the first time to a copious flood of tears. As thus he lay, humbled in the dust, with all his thoughts in the dark and narrow grave, the sun shone brightly on Venice, and her thronging thousands, replete with joy, sang their songs of triumph, and shouted the names of their gallant warriors and captains of their galleys. It could not be that his should be forgotten, for who had borne himself more bravely than he? And as a crowd passed in front of his paternal abode, their united voices proclaimed, "Gherardo! Gherardo! Long life and glory to Gherardo, the soldier of St. Mark!" The sounds struck his ears, but now they could elicit only a bitter smile. The passing hours did not restore tranquillity to the bereft bridegroom, but as the shades of night descended, a wild idea, an uncontrollable impulse, invaded him. And shall my fond eyes obtain not a glance of that being of love and beauty? Shall my Bianca, reasoned the passionate youth, if such movement of the feelings can be called reason, my betrothed, be consumed by vile worms, and I not see the loveliness she must have carried to the grave? She died but yesterday, must still be beautiful. Yes, I will see her once again. I will once again press those lips, though they be cold. Cold! At a late hour he secretly left his father's house for the well-known church. Alas, he was to have been married there. A handful of gold gained over the sacristano, who unlocked the door of the temple and retired. Gherardo stood alone, a few paces from Bianca's tomb. A few lamps burned here and there dimly before the effigies of the Virgin Mother and of the more conspicuous saints. The moon shed an uncertain light through the painted glass of the lofty and narrow Gothic windows, but away among the massy columns and through the long aisles of the church there fell the obscurity of the valley of the shadow of death, and sounds there were none save the fast-coming sighs of the hapless lover. The hour, the spot, the awful stillness were all calculated to overpower the mind with indescribable emotion. The age was one of extreme superstition, and our young soldier's philosophy had not taught him to rise superior to the popular credence. The state of his feelings, too, and nothing is more imaginative or creative of ideal horrors than a certain stage of grief, contributed to delude the senses, and as the cresset trembled in the moonlight, strangely coloured by the stained glass through which it passed, gleamed now brighter and now fainter, now resting on this object of somewhat grotesque architecture of the church, now on that, he saw or fancied the spirits of the departed rising one by one and mournfully waving their hands, as if warning him against sacrilegious intrusion on the regions of the dead. Through the postern door by which he had entered, and which the sacristano had left ajar, there suddenly blew a gust of the fresh night breeze, that, moaning among the columns and over the hollow marble pavement of the church, sounded in his ear like a voice, but not of earth, like the united lamentations of sad or guilt-burdened spirits. He clung to one of the pillars for support, and was for some moments incapable of motion. His natural courage and the intenseness of the feeling and purpose that had brought him thither soon, however, came to his aid, and he strode with hasty steps to the capella, or lateral recess of the temple, beneath which was the tomb of his bride's family. Here, in this deep recess, the moon could not shed a beam, but he was guided to the door of the sepulchre by a lamp that flickered on the altar, or capella. Hurried, breathless, he laid his hand upon that door, massy and bound with heavy iron and with bronze. It required a great effort to open it. He pressed his muscular shoulder against it. It receded, but as it turned on its unwilling hinges, it produced a hoarse rumbling sound that echoed like thunder in the vault beneath, and caused him to start back with trembling limbs and cold sweat on his brow. Again, however, desperation, love, the determination to see the lifeless form of his beloved, conquered his awe and the repugnance for disturbing the peace of the grave. Yet he paused ere he plunged into the horrible, palpable obscurity that lay beyond the door of the tomb, and crossing himself, murmured a prayer to the Blessed Virgin, who saw his woe, and might pity or pardon his sacrilegious audacity. He then rushed down a few steps through a short dark passage, and himself like a spectre entered the narrow chamber of death. A lamp beneath the crucifix burned at the head of the avello, or sarcophagus of Bianca, and a grated window near the roof the vault admitted the rays of the moon that fell almost perpendicularly on that cold white marble. He grasped at once the heavy cover of the coffin. Had he hesitated, he might have been effectually deterred from completing his sad wild enterprise. His nervous arms removed the weight, and then his eyes rested on the shrouded form of his Bianca, whose head was enveloped in a veil of pure white, and her decent limbs composed beneath an ample white robe. His brain reeled at the sight, and the lamp which he had grasped fell from his hand. When he recovered strength to proceed, the light from the grated window fell full in the open coffin, and as his trembling hands withdrew the veil, a clear, broad ray of the moon illumined the face of his lovely bride. And could this be death? Why, even thus she looked when life and love coursed through her young veins. Even thus, when after a day of joy she slept a balmy sleep, a night of peace, and were not the long, loose tresses crossed on her innocent bosom the same as erst, and the pale smooth brow, and the broad eyelids with their long black fringes, and the cherub mouth with lips slightly apart, as if smiling in some blissful dream? No, this cannot be death, cried Gherardo deliriously. She sleeps, she only sleeps. Oh, wake! In pity, wake, my Bianca, my love, my wife. He was silent for a moment, and gazed on her beautiful moonlit countenance, as if expecting she would really rise at his passionate adjuration. Bianca, continued he, my own Bianca, why dost thou slumber thus? Dost thou await the warm kisses of thy lover to awaken thee? I give them thee. And throwing himself across the marble coffin, he pressed his quivering lips to hers. But how did his whole soul rush to his mouth when he fancied he felt the breath of life on those pale lips? He pressed them again. If it was delusion, it continued, for the mildest, the most subdued of breathings seemed to pass from her lips to his. He raised her from the sarcophagus. He placed his hand on her heart, and language has no power to paint his emotions when he felt, plainly felt, that heart palpitate beneath his hand. Another moment, and her eyes opened, while a low murmur escaped her lips. Gherardo clasped her wildly in his embrace, and leaned for support against the sarcophagus, where, as they stood, mute, motionless, and pale, almost like statues in the moonlight, it would have been difficult to tell which of the two, or whether both, had not been awakened from the sleep of death. The chronicler's tale is told. The ignorance of the physicians, and the immediate sepulture after death, usual in the south, had consigned Bianca to the grave, from which the passion and impetuosity of her lover saved her so opportunely. The fair Venetian passed almost at once from the marble sarcophagus to the nuptial bed of silk and velvet. The church, where the echoes of her funeral dirge might almost seem yet to linger, pealed with the notes of her hymeneals, and her bridal coronet of white roses was supplied by the tree that had furnished flowers for her funeral. End of section 6.